You've been chosen.
You're not running. You're coming home. We're not kidnapping you. You're cargo.
Nick lay awake, staring at the dimly glowing numbers on the motel alarm clock. 4:17 a.m. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched into nothingness, the only sound the occasional hum of a passing car on the highway. In the other bed, Jonah snored softly, dead to the world. Haley, curled up under a thin motel blanket, was barely visible in the darkness. Nick sighed and rolled onto his side, adjusting his leg beneath the covers. The ache was worse tonight. Some nights it felt like his body was giving up on him, muscle by muscle, but he knew better than to say anything. Haley already had enough on her mind with her upcoming move. No need to make this about him. His phone vibrated, a soft, almost innocent chime in the quiet room. Nick frowned. No one texted him at this hour. He reached over, squinting at the screen. New message. Nomad. Nick's stomach dropped. Number it couldn't be. His thumb hovered over the notification before pressing it. A single line of text stared back at him. Still alive, I see. His breath hitched. Nomad was back. He shot up, suddenly wide awake. The mattress creaked under his weight as he turned toward Jonah. "Hey," he whispered, shoving his friend's shoulder. "Jonah, wake up!" Jonah grumbled something unintelligible, burying his face in the pillow. "Jonah," Nick hissed again, shaking him harder. "It's Nomad." Jonah's body tensed immediately. He pushed himself up, rubbing his eyes. "What?" Nick turned the phone toward him, letting him see the message. The sleep drained from Jonah's face in an instant. That son of a... Jonah stopped himself, glancing toward Haley. They both stayed quiet for a moment, but she didn't stir. Jonah grabbed his own phone from the nightstand, typing furiously. "He just sent you that?" Nick nodded. "Couple minutes ago." Jonah's face darkened. They hadn't heard from Nomad since their near expulsion from MIT. The hacker had framed them, planted false logs in the university's systems, and almost ruined their lives before disappearing without a trace. Jonah unlocked his laptop, the faint glow of the screen illuminating his sharp features. He pulled up their old encrypted email account, the one they had set up when they first tried tracking Nomad last year. Nothing new. Then, as if on cue, an email appeared. Subject, "Want to play a game?" Jonah and Nick exchanged a look. Jonah hesitated only for a second before clicking on it. The email contained a single link. Jonah didn't even think before pressing it. Instantly, the laptop screen flashed to life, but instead of a document or a message, it was video footage. Live footage. Nick felt his pulse skyrocket. The grainy, low-light camera showed an overhead view of their motel room. Jonah's breath hitched. "That's..." Nick snapped his head toward the nightstand. Haley's laptop sat there, closed but still powered on. The webcam's tiny red light was blinking. He was watching them. Nick shot up, slamming the laptop shut. "That bastard is watching us!" Jonah's hands were already flying across the keyboard, running a trace on the signal. I don't know how the hell he did this, but he's gonna regret it. Nick's hands shook, not from fear, but rage. He's too good, Jonah muttered, eyes scanning lines of code. But if he's arrogant enough to leave a signal, we can follow it. Nick exhaled sharply, trying to calm the fury bubbling inside him. Find him. Now! Jonah worked fast, his fingers a blur. A minute passed before a result popped up. His eyes widened. It's in Nevada, Jonah said. Somewhere near Groom Lake. Nick frowned. Groom Lake? Jonah looked up. Area 51. Silence filled the room. Nick sat back, processing. Nomad wasn't just some basement-dwelling hacker screwing with them. He was operating near one of the most secure and secretive places in the country. Jonah leaned back, rubbing his jaw. It's not too far off our route. We could check it out. Nick hesitated. His mind was screaming no, they had a plan. Get Haley to California. No detours. But Nomad had hacked into Haley's laptop. That alone was reason enough. Nick's jaw clenched. We're going. The next morning, Haley picked at a muffin as they sat in a roadside diner. She had noticed the shift in Nick's demeanor, the way he avoided looking at her. When he got up to grab coffee, she turned to Jonah. Did he say anything? Jonah hesitated. About what? She gave him a look. About me leaving. Jonah exhaled, stirring his coffee. He's upset, obviously, but I'm not getting in the middle of it. Haley looked down. She had known this trip was going to be difficult, but she hadn't expected this level of distance. Then she saw him. Nick was at the counter, struggling. He had grabbed the coffee cups, but his hands were shaking, his grip weak. One cup tilted, spilling hot liquid all over the floor. Haley stood immediately, rushing toward him. Nick! He staggered, catching himself against the counter. His breath was shaky, but he refused to meet her eyes. I'm fine. She reached for the remaining coffee cup, but he pulled it back. Nick, let me help. I said I'm fine. His voice was sharp. Haley's hands tightened into fists. She turned on her heel and walked away. Nick sighed, staring at the spilled coffee on the floor. He knew he had screwed up. Back at the car, Jonah nudged him. You sure about this? Nick nodded, gripping the steering wheel. We find him. Haley slid into the passenger seat. Find who? Nick hesitated, then glanced at Jonah. Haley's brow furrowed. What's going on? Nick exhaled. We're taking a detour. To where? He finally met her gaze. To meet Nomad. The house stood alone in the middle of the Nevada desert, a rotting husk of wood and rusted metal, the kind of place that looked abandoned for decades. The wind howled through the dry, empty land, rattling the warped shutters like bones shaking in the dark. Nick parked the car a few hundred feet away, just in case. If Nomad was here, they weren't going to walk straight into a trap. Jonah pulled his hoodie over his head and zipped it up. I swear to God, if this guy is just some loser messing with us. Nick shot him a look, then turned to Haley, who sat in the back seat, arms crossed. She had been quiet ever since they decided to stop here. You don't have to come, Nick said. Haley arched an eyebrow. You think I'm just gonna sit in the car while you two get kidnapped? Nick hesitated. We'll check it out first. Stay here. Keep the doors locked. She didn't like it, but she didn't argue. Jonah grabbed a flashlight, flicking it on. The weak yellow beam barely pierced the thick shadows inside the house as they stepped through the broken front door. The inside smelled of dust and decay. The wooden floor creaked under their weight. Broken furniture littered the space, old newspapers scattered like dead leaves. "Nomad," Jonah called, his voice bouncing off the walls. No answer. Nick's grip tightened on his crutches as they moved deeper inside. Then they found it. A trap door in the middle of the living room. Jonah knelt, running his hand along the edges. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in years." Nick shifted his weight, stomach twisting with unease. This whole thing felt wrong. Jonah pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A faint hum reached their ears, barely audible over the wind outside. Jonah grinned. "Bingo." Nick exhaled sharply. "Let's make this quick." They descended into the basement, the air turning stale and cold. The hum grew louder, coming from rows of metal server racks lining the walls, cables snaking across the concrete floor. Jonah whistled. "This is some next-level shit." Nick scanned the room. No sign of Nomad. No chairs, no sleeping bags, just machines blinking with quiet, methodical precision. A single monitor sat on a metal desk, the screen filled with scrolling lines of code. Jonah leaned in, squinting. These are live connections. He's tapped into something big. Nick's stomach clenched. Try to find out where he's broadcasting from. Jonah cracked his knuckles. On it. Then, a scream. Haley. The two bolted up the stairs. Nick slammed his shoulder against the doorframe, barely catching himself as they stumbled into the night. The car door was open. The driver's seat was empty. Haley was gone. Then they heard it, a struggle coming from the bushes nearby. Jonah ran ahead, flashlight beam shaking as he swept it over the desert landscape. Nick's heart pounded. His crutches sank into the dry earth as he pushed forward as fast as his body would let him. Then he saw her. Haley was in the air, no hands holding her, no ropes, just her body, thrashing as if an invisible force was pulling her into the sky. Nick lunged forward, reaching for her. "Haley!" Her eyes met his, wild, terrified. "Nick, help me!" Nick and Jonah ran, grabbing for her arms, but the moment they reached her, everything went white. A light, brighter than anything Nick had ever seen, exploded around them, swallowing their vision whole. It wasn't just light, it was something else. A force. A presence. Nick's body went weightless, his mind fractured. Then, darkness. Nick woke to a blinding white light. It wasn't sunlight, it was sterile, clinical, suffocating. His head throbbed, his body felt strange, disconnected. When he tried to move, he realized he couldn't feel his legs. Panic jolted through him like electricity. He tried to sit up, but thick straps pinned him down. His breathing quickened. His arms moved sluggishly, but at least they still worked. A door hissed open. Figures in protective suits stepped inside, their faces hidden behind smooth, featureless visors. Their movements were calculated, practiced, not like doctors, more like technicians handling equipment. "Where am I?" Nick rasped. His throat was dry, his voice barely more than a whisper. The suited figures didn't answer. One of them adjusted a device on the wall. A sharp hiss of depressurization filled the room. Then they wheeled him away. Nick's heart hammered as the ceiling lights glided past above him, as if he were sinking deeper into something unnatural. Finally, he was rolled into a plain white room, an interrogation chamber. The straps released with a quiet click, and he was placed in a wheelchair. Across from him sat a man in a dark suit, his thin face unreadable. A medical ID badge gleamed under the harsh overhead light. Dr. Wallace Damon Nick took a slow, shuddering breath. What the hell is going on? Dr. Damon folded his hands on the table, studying Nick like a specimen under glass. You experienced contact. Nick frowned. What? Damon leaned forward. Tell me what you remember. Nick's mind reeled. The house, the basement, Haley being pulled into the sky, the blinding light. He swallowed hard. Where's Haley? Damon's expression didn't change. She's being monitored. Nick's fingers dug into the arms of the wheelchair. Monitored. What the hell does that mean? Is she okay? Damon ignored his questions. You and your friends were exposed to a highly classified event. We believe you came into contact with an EBE, an extraterrestrial biological entity. The words slammed into Nick like a fist. He let out a hollow laugh. You're telling me we were abducted by aliens? Damon's gaze didn't waver. We're telling you that you were in the presence of a non-human intelligence, and that makes you an anomaly. Nick's pulse spiked. That doesn't answer anything. Damon tapped a gloved finger against the table. We're concerned about contamination, about what may have been left behind in you. Nick froze. Something left behind. He shook his head. That's insane. Damon exhaled slowly. Is it? Then something warm dripped onto Nick's lips. He frowned, touched his nose. Blood. Damon relaxed. His lips twitched into something close to relief. Good, he murmured. Just blood. Before Nick could react, two suited figures grabbed his wheelchair and rolled him out. Damon's voice followed him. We'll talk again soon. The next few days, if they were days, blurred into a cycle of tests. Nick was wheeled from room to room, subjected to scans, blood draws, neurological exams. The doctors never spoke, just recorded data and moved him along like he was part of an experiment. And the worst part, he never saw Haley, not until the third or maybe fourth day. They were passing through one of the winding, clinical hallways when Nick saw it, a hospital bed through a glass window. Haley. She was still, pale, hooked up to machines. Nick's breath hitched. He grabbed the arm of the nearest suited man. Stop. The man hesitated but didn't speak. Nick's heart pounded against his ribs. Let me see her. No answer. Nick's fingers dug into the man's sleeve. She's in a coma, isn't she? The suited figure gave the smallest nod. Nick clenched his jaw. You did this to her. The figure simply pushed him forward, away from the window, away from Haley. Nick didn't fight it. He was too stunned. What had they done to her? What had they done to him? The next session with Damon felt different. Nick was placed in the same cold interrogation room, but this time Damon brought something new. A screen. And on that screen, a video. Nick watched in horrified silence as the footage played. It was from his own camera. the one strapped to his shirt when they went to the house. The video showed the moment they ran outside. The struggle. Haley being pulled into the sky. Then, a shape, barely visible in the tree line behind her. Not human. It clung to the tree's branches like a predator waiting for its moment. Nick's stomach turned to ice. "Do you see it now?" Damon asked. Nick's mouth was dry. "What? What is that?" Damon tapped the screen. "That," he said, "is what took you." Nick's fingers curled into fists. His whole body trembled. This wasn't just some hacker screwing with them. This wasn't just Nomad. This was bigger. Nick looked at Damon. "You knew this was going to happen." Damon didn't deny it. Instead, he simply leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin. "We knew someone would come looking," he admitted. "We just didn't know it would be you." Nick felt like he couldn't breathe. "What do you mean?" Damon exhaled. Then he gestured to Nick's arm, to the tattooed numbers, 2, 3, 5, 41. Nick stared at them, and for the first time he felt genuinely afraid. The world around Nick was a blur of motion, alarms screaming through the corridors of whatever the hell this place was. His breath was ragged, his muscles burned, but his legs carried him forward, unstoppable, inhuman. Haley's hospital bed rattled behind him, the wheels barely keeping up as he dragged her through the sterile white hallways. The rope tying her bed to his wheelchair strained, but he didn't slow down. "Come on, Haley," he muttered under his breath. "Stay with me." She was awake now, barely, her glassy eyes struggling to focus. The implant jutting from her spine glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with the facility's flickering emergency lights. Nick didn't have time to think about it. Didn't have time to think about any of it. Damon was close. He could feel it. Behind him, boots pounded against the floor. Voices barked orders. "Contain subject 23,541. That was him. The numbers inked into his skin had never meant anything to him before. But now they were everything. Nick gritted his teeth, his alien-enhanced legs propelling him forward. He reached the final corridor, a long, featureless hallway leading to a set of reinforced metal doors. The exit. Nick let go of the wheelchair's controls, grabbing the bed's frame with his own hands. His prosthetic fingers dug into the metal, his strength enough to bend the bars. He kicked forward, crashing through the doors. The force sent them spiraling into the open desert. The surface. The sky was a deep, unnatural black. No stars, no moon. Nick staggered, his body processing the sheer, terrifying emptiness of the landscape. There was no sign of a base, no buildings, no fences, just sand, sand for miles. His breathing slowed. He turned, eyes scanning the horizon. Something was wrong. This wasn't Earth. Haley groaned softly, and Nick knelt beside her. "Haley?" His voice was raw. "Come on, we have to..." A shadow fell over them. Nick spun around. A vehicle approached, a truck. For a split second, Nick thought it was help. Someone had found them. But as it got closer, he saw the driver's eyes, glassy, vacant. And then he heard the horn, that deep, echoing horn that had been following them since the beginning. Nick ran, his legs inhumanly powerful. propelled him across the sand as fast as the truck. The driver tried to run him down. Nick dodged left, his enhanced limbs twisting unnaturally, moving in ways a human body never could. The driver jerked the wheel, trying to follow him. Haley was still on the ground. Nick saw the gun in the driver's hand before he could react. Then, a gunshot. Haley moved faster than she should have been able to. Her arm shot out, grabbing the driver's wrist and twisting. The gun clattered to the ground. She stared at her own hand as if seeing it for the first time. Nick knew that look. She was changing, just like him. Just like Jonah. Jonah. Nick felt the weight of his absence like a knife twisting in his ribs. Jonah had sacrificed himself to get them out. And now Nick wasn't even sure if they were out at all. A shadow loomed in the distance. Nick turned, his chest seizing with fear. A checkpoint. Beyond it, the only bridge out. They had to get across. The bridge. Nick threw the truck into high gear, speeding toward the checkpoint. Damon was already there, waiting. Nick could see him standing calmly at the roadblock, surrounded by armed soldiers. But something was wrong. Damon wasn't wearing his helmet. He wasn't even trying to hide anymore. Nick saw the truth before Damon even said it. Damon wasn't human. The flesh of his face was too smooth, too perfect. His eyes glowed faintly, the same eerie light that pulsed from Nick's own legs. A sick, twisted realization hit him like a sledgehammer. Damon. Nomad. It wasn't a name. It was a direction. Nomad equals Damon reversed. Nomad had never been a hacker. He had never been some rogue genius playing games with them. He had been luring them here. Nick felt his stomach turn. He had walked into a trap bigger than he ever could have imagined. Damon smiled. "You came looking for me," he said, his voice almost kind. "And now you've found me." Nick's hands clenched the wheel. He had one move left. He floored the accelerator. The truck roared forward, straight at the checkpoint. Damon didn't move. At the last second, spikes exploded onto the road. The truck's tires shredded instantly. Nick lost control. The impact threw them forward, the windshield shattering as the truck flipped. Haley was ripped away from him, her body thrown from the wreckage. Nick hit the pavement hard, his body skidding across the asphalt. He heard her scream. Then, nothing. His head swam. He struggled to sit up. Soldiers were already dragging Haley away. Nick crawled forward, his new legs shaking, glitching from the crash. "Haley!" She was lifted onto a stretcher, her body limp. Nick saw her, reach for him. Her fingers barely grazing the ground before she was carried onto a helicopter. The rotors spun up. Nick staggered forward. The horns blared. The sky cracked open. Damon stepped beside him, watching the helicopter ascend. "You can't reach her," Damon said softly. Nick's blood boiled. Damon turned to him, smiling. "But you were never meant to." Nick launched forward. His legs kicked into overdrive, propelling him faster than anything human. Faster than he had ever run before. The world blurred. The bridge loomed ahead. And then, glass. Nick passed through something invisible, and everything changed. Not Earth. Nick stumbled to a stop. The air felt wrong. He turned. Behind him, the facility. But beyond it, nothing. Space, stars, a planet, huge, distant, glowing. Nick's stomach dropped. He wasn't on Earth anymore. Damon stepped beside him, his human disguise flickering. Beyond the glass, ships floated in the void. And on them, people. More of them. More human test subjects. Nick turned, staring into Damon's glowing eyes. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. Damon smiled. "This," he said, gesturing toward the planet outside, "is home." A deep, reverberating horn echoed across the ship. Nick looked down at his arm, at the tattooed numbers. He wasn't a prisoner. He was cargo. The ship moved forward, toward the alien world. Nick wasn't escaping. He was arriving.